Good evening. Welcome to Money Matters. I'm Charlie Shields of Wells Fargo Advisors. My co-host, Patricia Tobin, is from Merrill Lynch. We're both SIPC members, so I can keep the compliance people happy. And our special guest is David Frees, Esquire. He's a founding partner of Unruh Turner Burke Frees, and we're going to find out a lot about estate planning. He's been doing it for 30 years. It's going to be a good show. Stick with us. Pat, how are you?
Good to see you again.
Good to see you. Okay, well, let's talk about the markets a little bit. Everybody seems focused on the bright, shiny object of the arguments in Washington, D.C., and they think that's what's driving the markets. And when Trump sends out a tweet, they're afraid the market will go down. And when somebody says we're going to fix the medical system, the market goes up. Is that what's really happening? Is Washington driving this thing?
I don't think so. I think what's really driving it are corporate profits. And the corporate profits are doing well. And I think in general, people are feeling good. Trump has promised to cut tax rates. That's a happy thought.
Yeah.
He ran on a pro-business platform, and that's good. And people are feeling it. You go out to the restaurants and what have you, and they're packed.
Yeah.
So for the first time in a long time, people are feeling good, and when they feel good, they put their money into the market.
Yeah, and I think he's also talking about cutting regulations, which will be helpful if he doesn't go too far. We don't want people fearing another 2008, so we'll have to watch what regulations they take down and whether they really help the small and mid-sized companies, which we'll talk about later.
Yes.
Speaking of good economies, I think another factor is the synchronized world recovery. I don't want to time the show because we don't want our viewers and listeners thinking they should market time based on anything we say.
Correct.
But I was recently on a vacation to Hawaii, and condos that used to be $1 million are now $5 million, and the people who bought them at one who don't want to move have their taxes go up 5 times. And meanwhile, from Korea and even Russia and Australia and Japan, people are coming in and buying condos for $5, $10, $20 million, and they're only occupying them 2 months out of the year. So I'm starting to think that the rest of the world isn't in as bad a shape as we read about in Washington. What's your thought on that?
I have to agree. I was looking at the indexes just last week, and I was really surprised at how well the international has been doing.
Sure.
Now, we're not out of the woods. You know, France still has a big general election coming up,
Yeah.
and anything could happen in Greece.
Yeah.
But I was pleasantly surprised to see that the international securities are doing as well as they're doing.
So was I, so am I, and I believe it'll continue. I think they're just a few years behind us in their recovery. So as we start to get the high PEs and everything, if the rest of the world is starting to do more business with us, maybe the earnings, as you said, will pick up, and then these price-to-earnings ratios won't be out of line because the earnings are starting to kick in.
Correct.
Okay. Well, let's talk about a gentleman named Edson Gould, who used to talk about 3 steps and a stumble. Whenever Greenspan and his predecessors would be raising interest rates, the theory was on the 3rd rate hike, it was time to watch out below for the stock market. Now that we're so low and we're starting in smaller increments, do you think that 3 steps and a stumble rule is any good anymore?
Well, I don't think it's going to apply this time around because the steps have been quite small.
Yeah.
You know, if we were looking at half-point steps or 3/4-point steps, then I think Mr. Gould's prognosis would be the case today. But I don't think so. How about you?
I agree. When I remember the book Maestro about Alan Greenspan, Bob Woodward wrote that book, and Greenspan would boast that he would raise rates till he thought he had it about right, and he'd throw one more in for insurance. And the one more for insurance, that 3rd rate hike or starting to go 50 or 75 basis points, would scare the market, and then we'd end up with a recession, and then he'd start lowering rates, and once he thought he had it right, he'd take one more step down for insurance, so we had these wild swings that were going on.
Right.
Well, now we're coming out of such a deep hole, and if you look at the economic numbers the way they are right now, you could normally expect a 2.5% or 3% short-term rate. But the Fed is being careful and they're going in baby steps. So it wouldn't surprise me if the next couple of rate hikes are followed by market rallies. And now we have to try to use a new rule instead of 3 steps and a stumble. So maybe if we get up toward that 2.5%, or maybe 2, because that will be such a series of hikes, then maybe we have to worry about a 15 or 20% correction. Of course, you never know when those are coming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. Well, bond yields. If the Fed is raising rates in slowly but surely, do you think people will be afraid that they're getting behind the inflation rate and therefore will have higher long-term rates? Or do you think people will feel like the Fed's got this under control and the long-term rates won't be going up too much?
Actually, I think the latter. I don't see any rush out of bonds yet. I think people are looking at these incremental steps and saying, well, I can deal with a 1/4 point hike. It's not going to lower the price of my bonds that much. So
Okay.
I'll hang in there a little bit longer because I still need the cash flow.
Sure.
If the rate hikes start getting larger, then I think you'll start to see money move out of the bond market and into the stock market.
Okay. Well, these rate hikes, everyone has been guessing that this is the time that the long-term interest rates are no longer coming down, that the back's going to be broken, and the speculators sell, and then they turn out to be wrong for the last 3 or 4 years. And so eventually they'll get it right. But I agree with you that I think it's going to be a while before we're going to say, let's say, a 3.5% 10-year bond or a 4.5% 30-year bond. We may get there eventually.
Right.
But I don't think it'll happen right now. Well, another one of the inflation indicators I like to watch out for is gold. Is gold telling us anything about whether inflation's coming back, in your opinion?
Very interesting question. I don't think so, because I think the move up in gold is being countered by the move down in energy prices.
Okay.
And oil prices have been dropping. If we have more deregulation by Mr. Trump, that could add to yet more supply. More supply is going to put a damper on rising prices. So gold, yeah, you're right, gold's been going up, but energy's been going down.
And I think those are two things to watch. You make an excellent point. I believe that gold may start to go up if oil turns and starts to go back up. And initially, when OPEC was deciding they would cut production, they thought that they could keep oil prices kind of in a range between 50 and 60. But then we had all of the U.S. marginal players kick in, and all of a sudden we're going below 50. And I just saw recently that OPEC had a meeting with U.S. oil producers, so maybe they're starting to figure out they have mutual interests and they better work together. My best guess is we will get into a trading range between 50 and 60, and I think that might send gold a little bit higher, but it's going to depend on wages and how fast wages are going up. And in the last jobs report, I noticed that even though 300,000 people came back into the labor force, they were absorbed pretty well.
They were, and yes, we had a wages rise 2.8% last year. And that's the first time in a long time that we're seeing it. We're also starting to see a lot of demand for talent. People are starting to jump from job to job because there's a lot of poaching going on. So the labor market has been quite strong.
For people with skills.
For people, oh yes, absolutely,
Yes.
for people with skills.
And it's kind of interesting to watch what's happening with the minimum wage hikes around the country. I was out in California and on my way out to Hawaii, and we went to a restaurant, and I noticed that we were able to just swipe our card through pay our bill right at our table and get the whole transaction done right there. They didn't have somebody at the, I guess the manager's floating around making sure nobody walks out the door. But they're doing things to eliminate employees to get rid of the $15 employee that they really can't afford.
Well, definitely. And as robotics develop more and more and more, there's going to be less and less jobs for the unskilled worker. You're absolutely right.
So that brings the point. Trump has talked about trying to make sure he helps people in these inner cities, and we have to train these young men and women I think that's one of the most important things going on in this country. We want them to have a viable job with some skills, and I think we have to get away from the idea that everybody needs a 4-year college education, and hopefully corporations will start getting involved in training for the skills that they're going to need when these people come out, and maybe we'll have a different kind of a training or education system than we've had in the past. You got any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think it's going to boil down to learning for life. It's not you finish high school and you're done your education. That in order to survive in the coming economy, you're going to have to learn and relearn and learn new things. It's going to be a lifelong skill. But yes, I can see the corporations stepping in, particularly in the manufacturing area, because they are drawing upon these employees, and the skills that they need are getting more and more refined.
Okay, well, let's try to help one of our viewers. Thomas West of Exton says, how do you beat your biases when buying or selling stocks? In other words, don't get married to a stock type of a concept.
Tom, that is an excellent question. And with all my years of experience, what I have found to be a major stumbling block for the do-it-yourself investor is biases. What in technical terms it's referred to as behavioral finance. And Charlie, you and I have been trained in behavioral finance, which is the human impact on performance and the mistakes that humans tend to make. Tom, if there was ever an argument for working with a professional like Charlie or myself, it is the issue of biases. Because as professionals, we help our clients deal with the lions and the tigers in the room, fear and greed. And we deal with those tigers all the time for our clients.
That's a great answer. Okay, thank you for that. If you have a question, we're going to show you right now how you can get it into us. Here's a tape to give you that information.
You can have your questions answered on Money Matters. Please go to our website, money-matterstv.com. On our homepage, click on the banner on the right that says, Send us your questions. While you're on our website, you can find information about our host and guests, as well as show notes and links about this show and past shows. Money Matters is also available as a podcast on iTunes and Stitcher, so you can listen to Money Matters while you're on the go. That website address, again, is money, M-O-N-E-Y, -matters, M-A-T-T-E-R-S, TV.com.
Okay, now we're back with our special guest, David Frees, who, as I said at the start, has 30 years of estate planning behind him. David, talk to us about why do people need estate planning? Talk to us and to our viewers and listeners about why they should come to someone like you.
Sure. I just want to say I really enjoyed that last segment too. We've been talking a lot about that, who we want to hire, and we just want to hire people that are really good learners, not that have a specific skill set necessarily. So I think you're both right on the money.
Thank you.
I think that for most people early in life, the reasons for doing estate plan are different than they are later in life. Early in life, it's to make sure that you get to pick who the guardian is for your children, and that there's a trust to protect them from themselves maybe. So if something were to happen to both parents, an 18 or a 23-year-old doesn't buy a Ferrari with the money, that instead they still go and get employed, and maybe the trust helps them a little bit but doesn't make them dependent upon it. If those things worry you, that's why you do it.
Sure.
Later in life, we find that people's motivations for doing estate planning and the reasons that they're doing it are really different. So there seems to be sort of a switch that's flipped somewhere between 50 and 53, so I've kind of grown into my demographic.
So what are the concerns of the people who have now shifted to a new way of thinking?
At that point, everybody's had an experience of probably having a friend or someone pass away, and they see what happens if you don't do it. That it could be, disastrous and time-consuming, and that there are extra taxes paid and things like that. But more importantly, for most people that are married or divorced with children and grandchildren, they're really interested in making sure that those children and grandchildren don't lose those assets they're going to inherit in a divorce or in a lawsuit. Most of my clients and people at that stage in their life have been in business for a long time, and they know how hard it is to accumulate assets and wealth, and how hard it is to protect it. So they're really interested in doing that for their kids. they're also planning their own retirements. And so they begin focusing on, how do I make sure that my children have a reasonable retirement, because it's getting to be harder and harder and harder in an economy where we have these kind of returns that we've had, notwithstanding, the recent couple of years in the markets. It's harder and harder and harder, most of my clients think, for their children to provide for their own retirement. So they're interested in doing that as well. And they're interested in protecting a spouse, if they predecease the spouse, from his or her own remarriage and divorce.
Sure.
So lots of different questions before that 50-year kind of anniversary of your birth, and then after.
Okay.
Well, let me put a little twist on that, David, because this is something I see all the time. Many times it's the senior generation who actually made the money.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very worried that the next generation might not be as careful with the money as they are. Or the next generation could be subject to creditors.
Mm-hmm.
Or the next generation could have a divorce. How does someone who has earned the money and realize that they're going to leave this earth with money left behind try to protect it from the grave?
So most people earlier in life have trust. This would be very common. Somebody has a trust and says, there's $1 million in this trust, or $10 million for my child. And at 25, they're going to get some of it. At 30, they're going to get some of it. At 35, it's going to terminate. But when you sort of cross over into the concerns that you're talking about and trying to protect that wealth, a lot of times we will not have that trust terminate any longer. We'll have that trust go on for the life of the child, but we might have the child, or who now is an adult, become a co-trustee of their own trust. So they're responsible with an independent trustee for helping to manage it. But if they're not the only trustee and the only beneficiary, it's probably going to be protected from their creditors if we do a couple of things in the trust. So for example, if I made my daughter the sole beneficiary and the sole trustee of her trust, and we gave the trustee the power to give her money anytime for any reason, that would be includable and taxable in her estate. If she got sued because of a car accident or something having to do with business, her creditors could get at that. They would just say, Judge, she's the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. It's really her money. Mm-hmm. But if we give her an independent trustee, that could be a bank or a trust company, it could be an individual, just somebody that's not related to her. In the Internal Revenue Code, they call it a related or subordinate party. So somebody that she doesn't control. If we give her a co-trustee and we say at 30 or 35, Jamie gets to be a co-trustee of her own trust, she can run the money, she can use the money. Instead of taking money out of the trust to buy a shore house, she might buy, now my son-in-law is going to be mad at me with this example, but she might buy the shore house in the trust.
Right.
It's not that I don't like or trust my son-in-law, I like him very much, but we have a 52% divorce rate in our society, so people are concerned about that.
Yes.
And many of our children they're getting married for the first time, they don't get a prenuptial agreement. Mm-hmm. In a perfect world, we'd have both. A prenuptial agreement, which is kind of like a big moat around the wealth, and then this kind of trust that I'm talking about, which would be a high-walled fortress with maybe some archers on top of it. If we combine those, we've got a lot more protection for our sons and daughters.
Okay, well, let's shift over for a minute to IRAs, 401ks, that type of thing. So let's suppose that a doctor loves his financial advisor and he's got his IRAs with him, or his 401k, and then another firm is buying out this doctor firm. Mm-hmm. Well, now you have a situation where that money's going to be managed somewhere else, and this doctor may not be happy with it, so now he's got to choose, do I want to move my 401k to an IRA? Mm-hmm. Is he more at risk if he keeps his financial advisor and moves it to an IRA, or would he be better off protected from malpractice if he stays in a 401k?
So I would leave that largely. There are some distinctions in the law about which one has greater creditor protection. Okay. But I would say that that doctor in that particular circumstance is going to be guided by what he thinks is best for him in terms of getting return on investment and where he wants it managed.
And different states have different rules about this.
And
right?
they do, that's correct. So you'd have to consult your counsel in that particular state, and you have to decide, who do I really know and like and trust here to manage this money? But one thing's clear, regardless of where it ends up, he should consider now leaving it to the next generation in a trust rather than outright. Because up until very recently, most lawyers that were doing this kind of work thought that if we left our IRAs to our kids, that they would get the same creditor protection that we have and that you're talking about.
Right.
But the Supreme Court recently ruled in a case that we call the Clark estate that Congress didn't intend that. They intended for kids to be able to get inherited IRAs and to stretch them out and to keep them for their own retirement. But they did not intend for the kids who didn't make the wealth to get that creditor protection. Congress wanted that creditor protection for the wealth creating generation. So what that means is that we actually use an old technique for a new reason. We would use IRA trusts rather than leaving it outright to the child, because if we have a $3 million IRA or 401k, and we leave it a third to 3 kids, and one of those kids gets sued or divorced and ends up in bankruptcy court, the Supreme Court's ruled that their creditors can get that, which many people thought was not the case before. We now know it is. So we would create either, and viewers don't need to worry about this distinction, but they would want to talk to their advisors about whether they want a conduit trust or an accumulation trust. And if they've got really smart lawyers, they can have their cake and eat it too. They could do a trust that is a conduit trust for their kids for the IRA. And if the kids need additional protection, it can be turned into an accumulation
I think
trust.
you're convincing the viewers and listeners they need a guy like you to help them with this sort of thing.
Well, they don't need me, but they probably, these two things that we talked about, creditor protection trust to make sure that your kids don't lose it in a divorce or business lawsuit, that's not something you would pull off the internet or go to a piece of software to do.
Oh, that's not LegalZoom, huh?
There's lots of people that call us where we actually suggest that that's a viable solution for them.
Yeah.
But this is a little bit more complicated.
Yeah.
Same with the IRA trusts, and this question that you have that comes before that, should I use an IRA or keep it in my 401k or roll it out? Those are questions where you really need advisors to talk to about that.
Sure.
Yes. Now, as advisors doing a financial planning practice, I always ask people, how old is your will? How old is your trust? And but I don't have a solid answer as to how often people should actually update it, because the laws do change.
Sure. And there are a number of reasons that we tell people that they should, update them on a fairly regular schedule. By that I mean, if somebody calls me 3 years after they've done their will, assuming there have been no big earth-shattering changes in the law, most people's circumstances haven't changed that much, so they're still pretty good. The kids are only a few years older, they're probably in the same job, or they're still building the same business. But typically by 5 to 7 years, and I've never seen a case where somebody comes to me 10 years later where I say, don't worry, this document is perfectly fine.
Right.
So what's gone on to cause that? Well, changes in the law, and they could happen a year after you do your estate planning. Changes in your kids' circumstances. Kids get older, things happen that you weren't expecting or anticipating. Somebody has a drug or alcohol dependency. They got married and divorced. Just things that you weren't thinking of when you did it. Changes in your business circumstances or your investment portfolio. Obviously, the longer you go, the more likely it is that your wealth is going to build either in retirement or after-tax
We hope
accounts. Yeah, that's right. And you may use different planning techniques. If somebody comes to see me and they have $1 million to $5 million net worth, they're going to be using the same kind of planning techniques as one another. But if somebody has an $11 to $20 million net worth, they're going to be using a different set, or they're at least going to think about different issues than somebody has a 5.
Well, this time is flying by. Can you take a couple of minutes to talk to us about siblings that want to sue each other and how the mom and dad can feel good that they'll try to minimize that type of thing?
Well, you have your pulse on, you have your finger on the pulse of what's going on in our society. As we all live longer, our heirs aren't inheriting the money when they thought they were. And we had a market that just recently has sort of changed, but a lot of times people were getting smaller inheritances much later in life than they thought they were going to. And so that has resulted in some sort of societal struggles. So the amount of litigation over wills and trusts and how they're planned has gone up, not down.
Yes.
And people have a lot of times used techniques that made perfectly good sense at one point in their life but no longer do. And so that again can really create problems. So one of the things that we're advocates of to help deal with this issue is consider, and in many states you can't do this, consider what's called an interorum clause, or a clause that says if you challenge this, you might lose your inheritance. That makes people stop and think about whether they really want to do it.
We have a clause in ours that if one sues, the other one will be given $100,000 out of it to hire a lawyer and fight it.
That's interesting. Same kind of thing, creating a disincentive to
Sure.
fight. Another thing is consider having a family meeting where what you've done is explained with
Yes.
some level of detail or not. But here's the big picture, and here's the executor, and here's the trustee, and here's the trust protector, here's who they are, so that people hit the ground running and they have a chance while mom and dad are alive to understand that these decisions weren't made because mom loved or didn't love them. They were made for other very practical reasons. And also you can, we're kind of in the vanguard now, but you could definitely talk to your advisors about putting arbitration or mediation clauses into wills too. Because once people go to battle, and they've hired lawyers and ponied up these big fees, they're much more likely to have an irretrievable breakdown of their relationships.
I think we got time for one more, Pat. You got another question?
I would say there's a number of clients that need this. How do you choose what type of client you can best help?
Oh, that's a great question, and it's good for the consumer too. Because not every lawyer is great at everything, and not every trust and estates planning attorney. We don't have specialization in Pennsylvania because once you pass the bar, you can practice.
Right.
So you need, as a consumer, to be asking a lot of questions when you go in. Is it on an hourly basis or is it on a flat fee? Who are the kinds of people that you help?
Right.
For example, in my practice, we will work with blended families, but it's not who we look for, because they're much more complicated, and people a lot of times don't recognize how complicated it is. So when it comes in, it's, we say you've got to consider these kinds of things. That could come as a shock to them. So it's really good to ask the lawyers, how many estates of $1 to $5 million or $11 to $20 million, or wherever you are personally, how many estates of this type have you administered? Because lawyers a lot of times will learn as they administer estates things to be careful of in the drafting.
I just got a quick question
Sure.
for you. If somebody says, well, $10 million is what's protected, and I've only got 7, do you still encourage people to come and see you? Kind of a yes or no answer?
The quick answer is yes, because the 5 still isn't automatic, even though we have what's called portability.
It could change tomorrow when they start looking for more money, right?
And by the time they pass away, it could be a whole lot more if the markets continue to do well.
Sure, and so you'd have to continue to monitor it. Okay, well, thanks for being with us. You've given us some great information.
Thank you.
This show went flying by. I hope you'll come back and see us again.
I'll be happy to. It was a great
Great.
experience.
Well, next week we're going to have Adam Glazer from Benjamin's Desk, which is a startup in Center City. And I get their emails, and they're doing a lot of exciting things, and they're growing rapidly. I think you'll be interested in seeing why they're growing rapidly. It'll be a great show. Stick with us. As far as we're concerned, your money matters.